Hey friends, this week's episode is brought to you by CROP, the Center for Rural Opportunity and Power, an organization dedicated to helping rural communities thrive through renewable energy. Across the country, farmers and landowners are discovering how clean energy projects can create new income streams and strengthen local economies. CROP provides the resources to help them make informed decisions. Learn more about the real benefits of renewable energy at cropamerica.com or by visiting the link in today's show notes. Hi, I'm Caitlin Dubin, and this is the Rural Woman Podcast. I'm a first-generation farmer who married into agriculture. Born and raised in a city, I was so unfamiliar with where my food came from, but I was determined to figure it out. Through my journey into agriculture, I saw women who were strong but humble, often taking a back seat. To me, these women were leaders who deserved a seat at the table. I created the Rural Woman Podcast to share the voices of women in an industry whose stories often went untold. The rural entrepreneurs who live and breathe their work, full of grit and pride. We come here to share our stories, to be in community with each other, to be challenged and inspired, but most importantly, to be celebrated and to be heard. We may not all live, farm, ranch, or homestead the same, but we are all connected. We are rural women, and our stories are worthy of being told. Hey everyone, welcome back to this special featured episode of the Rural Woman Podcast. Today you'll meet Laurie Mazer. Laurie is an experienced founder and entrepreneur with a 20-year history of developing solar and wind projects of every size and scale in every corner of the U.S. She also helps her clients to provide mentorship of their growing teams and to develop successful wind and solar projects in Texas, Oklahoma, Ohio, and many other states. She is the co-founder of a mid-sized solar development company focused on community-sized solar projects, where she uses her years of experience to site, permit, and ultimately build solar projects in Pennsylvania. I want to give a big thank you to those of you who saw and answered our call for questions over on the Rural Woman Podcast social media pages. Be sure, if you're not following on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads, you find us over at the Rural Woman Podcast. Without further ado, let's get to our conversation today with Laurie. Laurie, welcome to the Rural Woman Podcast. How are you today?
I'm really well, Caitlin. How are you?
I'm doing so well. Thank you so much for joining me. This is a topic that we're talking about today that I am super interested in learning more about, and it sounds like my listeners are too.
That's great. I'm excited.
For the folks who are unfamiliar with you, Laurie, give us your background. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and how you got started in renewable energy.
So I have been doing renewable energy for the last 20 years. So on the development side, which means figuring out all the bits and pieces that need to come together to make a project actually get built. So I've worked on utility scale wind projects, community scale solar projects, and utility scale solar projects throughout my career. Yeah, and I live currently in Pennsylvania. I used to live on the West Coast, and I have traveled, I think, to almost every state in the U.S. and probably worked on energy projects in almost all of them, with a lot of time spent in the Midwest, like Nebraska and Oklahoma and Texas.
Very cool. What got you started in renewable energy?
I think, I don't know if anyone else felt idealistic and bright and shiny when they were in their 20s, but I felt like I really wanted to do something impactful. And I had been hearing a lot about wind energy projects. This was 2004, so quite a while ago. And so I had been hearing a lot about wind energy projects and offshore wind and solar projects in Europe. And I interviewed as kind of just an office manager at a company that was doing those projects throughout the US and in the UK. And I got a job as an office manager. And probably one of the luckiest things is I I ended up working for someone who was deeply devoted to mentorship. So just someone who really, I'll give myself a little credit that I did spend my lunch hour kind of like on the Danish wind energy site, trying to figure out how people knew where it was windy versus not windy and asking lots of questions. But I really had someone who took that curiosity and said, well, this is enthusiasm and we can harness it, and gave me a lot of early opportunities to travel to Texas and to meet with landowners and to start really understanding what it takes to build a complex energy project.
Very cool. And I love what you said about harnessing the energy of a 20-year-old. I wish we could bottle that and sell it somehow.
Oh my goodness. And really also to have that mentorship wisdom to put up with a lot of the kind of overly exuberant, things that go with a 20-year-old who's like, wait, what about this? And they're like, yeah, in due time. But I didn't ever feel tempered. I just felt really supported. And so, yeah. And also the landowners that I met were wonderful farmers who'd been stewards of their family lands for generations. And so there was just such a great learning both ways, both me learning my career and then also learning a lot about agriculture in the US and in other places. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm just curious, out of a personal note, your connection with agriculture or rural America before you started in this career, what were kind of some of your first memories around food being grown?
Yeah, so I grew up in a pretty small town, and I grew up, my best friend, her dad was someone who farmed, and I do remember hay baling with them as a kid and riding horses on their farm and being very jealous that they had a horse, and her dad just telling me that it was only a headache and a giant way and a way to eat through money, that's what horses were good for, is spending money on. So yeah, so I grew up in a pretty rural small town community and just really I saw a lot of the boredom, that I had as a teenager, and this kind of thirst for understanding and learning more. And then additionally, kind of to my own career, some of the opportunities for independence and sustainability and kind of community choice in what you want, and building the environment in community with your friends and neighbors that reflects kind of what you want and your values. And so that does actually fit in with renewable energy, which is kind of weird, but it really does. Energy independence and the idea that we can choose power sources and how we want to power our farms and our schools and things like that, and make decisions and choices about that.
So, Laurie, what defines a utility scale renewable energy project, and how does it work?
Yeah. So I'll keep it really simple, which is just the idea that it's really similar to any other power plant. And I think maybe other folks are like I was, where I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about what happened before I flipped a light switch. But all throughout our world, there are power lines, which I think people are pretty familiar with, of different voltages. And then there are different power plants that are fueled by different things. So a renewable energy utility scale project is a project that's big. So it's one that can serve, hundreds and thousands of homes with the electricity. So it's different than the solar panels on your roof or the homeowner wind turbine in your backyard that just feeds your own house. They're large scale projects that are interconnected to the high voltage grid. So they operate just in the same way the power plant does, where they send their energy back into the large electrical grid. And renewable really just means the idea. I think I did a career day at a school last week, and one of the kids said, well, actually the sun is dying, so it's not renewable. When the sun dies, it's not. And I said, okay, within our lifetime and the next 1,000 lifetimes before the sun dies, we consider that we don't have to pay for sunshine, and that it comes up every day, whether or not we do something. So we don't have to extract it from the ground, and we don't have to mine for it or anything like that. So it's renewable resources are things that we think of usually that have low to zero emissions in their energy production, that we just use a natural resource that's already existing without having to go and get it. So like a coal or a natural gas being different than renewables in that way.
You have to love the things that come out of kids' mouths.
Well, sometimes they're a little bit smarter than some of the things that come out of adults. I was like, yes, sir, you are right. That is
right.
That is a flaw in my definition. I agree. So it was really good, out of the mouths of babes,
Right. The way that you described it, of power poles, it's just a different power pole. And I've never thought of it that way. And it's funny because, in agriculture and in rural settings, there can be that, pushback when it comes to renewable energy. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. But to put it in the sense of, do we really protest power poles? Not often, right? So there's always that different piece of looking at it. So thank you for saying that. That was my light switch moment of renewable energy.
Yeah, exactly. It is. It's our built environment and it's how we actually power our lives, but we don't have to engage with it a lot. But that is what's different about doing development in rural communities is you really do have to engage with it and you have to understand how the impacts will be on the local community.
Absolutely. So something that I did before we sat down for our interview is I asked my community online through the Rural Women Podcast Facebook group and Instagram, Threads even. I asked everywhere, what were your questions for Laurie? And we got quite a few of them, and I'm going to intertwine them through our conversation today. But one of the questions that came up quite often was, how do you choose where to put this renewable energy source, whether it's wind turbines or solar power? How do you choose which agricultural land that you are going to put your new projects?
I know. And I think everyone thinks I just choose the one that's next to their house when they don't want it. So I'm like, that isn't actually my rubric. And that isn't the rubric of it. And there is so much thought that goes into the siting of these projects. And maybe I'll just give a tiny piece to like the larger energy infrastructure. Like, where do we need power? Like that's definitely a consideration. Like, where are utilities? Where is there not enough generation, either because coal plants are coming offline or because, like Texas, there's so much load growth that we really just, like, we're experiencing price spikes and outages and things like that because there isn't enough energy. So that's always in the background. And then the kind of more nitty gritty, which is what I think your community was talking about, is how do we pick the place? And I think we basically use a lot of mapping technology to show us, like, where there are wetlands, where there are threatened and endangered species, where there are national monuments, and we avoid all of those places. We try and avoid places with, near historical sites, things like that, where a project won't be able to kind of fit in with the community. And then another piece is just kind of what we talked about with the physical environment. It needs to be near transmission lines. So usually if you're already looking at power poles, you've got electricity moving through your area. And what we try to do is site our projects near to those power poles so we can get our power to market. Another consideration that I think is really important is the willingness. Like we call people, and that's a lot of my job, is just having those very awkward first conversations where I say, like, hey, your property has a really strong wind resource or really strong solar resource and it's right near a power line. And we're interested in talking to you if this is something that you are interested in doing. And it's something that doesn't cost the landowner any money. It's something where we pay them, but it's a 30-year relationship. It's a long-term lease. And as we've said, it's not for nothing. Wind turbines are quite large. You can't really hide them. Solar panels, we do a lot around screening and all that, but it is something that will be their neighbor for 30 years. So we really try and explain to them all those pieces. And we don't have the power of eminent domain, so we only cite projects where landowners are excited and willing to host them.
Very interesting. So take me through the process. I'm a farmer. I get the phone call from Laurie saying, hey, have you ever considered this? What is it like for a farmer to lease land to a renewable energy project?
I think I was joking with a rancher the other day about how we just operate on a time scale of kind of waiting and seasons, and that things seem to go really slow until all of a sudden, just like a harvest, all of a sudden everything's happening at once. And that's a little bit what the development process is like. When a landowner first engages with me, I usually, and most of the companies and good industry practice is to, if someone's interested in leasing the land, you send them a copy of a document that will be the lease agreement that they sign. And then you work with them to help them find local counsel, like someone who can be their lawyer, because you're often negotiating as a landowner with a larger corporate entity that has more experience in this than you do. So I'm always really cautious and advise landowners that they should, if they want to get legal representation, they should feel really, really empowered to do that. So they understand every bit of this contract that governs our relationship for the next 30 years. And then once we've entered into an agreement, we have usually a development time period, which is when we go out and we get permits. We do studies about the types of soil. We do studies about erosion. We design our power plant, our solar energy facility, our solar farm, or our wind farm to be as compatible with the local environment as we can. And that's to be good stewards. But additionally, it's to like keep the project, well maintained. You don't want erosion and soils leaving the ground, and you don't want to cause runoff or things like that. So we really do a lot of studies. So you do environmental studies and you do land surveys to make sure that you know exactly what's out there and where the property boundary lines are and everything. And then you start to design your project. And then we also work with the local utility or with the authority of the power lines and talk to them about what needs to happen to be able to put this project into the grid system without causing any blackouts or any issues. So they study us and they often tell us what kind of upgrades, like what we have to pay for to make the grid more stable to allow the project in. Yeah, and so then we're kind of trucking along, and this is usually like, I think the fastest project I've ever seen was like 18 months from signing the lease until wind turbines being constructed. And so usually it's a bit longer, between 3 to 5 years. And then we show the landowner the design. We work with them to figure out if everything is sited in a way that works with them. We get our local permits and we get our any other federal permits. We get our permission to interconnect, and then we start construction. And that's like a 6 to 12 month period. And that's what I advise people. That's when you're really going to know we're there. It's a big, major construction project, and having that day-to-day contact with your construction managers. And then once the project's operational, there's a lot of grass growing, there's some sunlight shining, and there's some wind turbines spinning, hopefully. And they're really not intrusive. If they've been well sited, then they just become a part of the landscape and a part of the built environment that is around you. But that construction period is probably the most taxing from a landowner perspective.
There's just so much that goes into it that, when we think of it as a farmer, we think, oh, that's really overwhelming. There's too many things to do. But like you said, it's not a lot of the farmer doing the actual crossing the T's and dotting the I's. It's, they have agreed to this, and now the experts get to come in and do what they do best.
That's totally true. I think the key piece, though, that I often, and that I'm sure you and your listeners would feel aligned with, is just that the expertise of the local community is huge. Like I have learned, because I'm weird and interested, I've learned a lot about longhorn cattle, but I've also learned about the effect of like what time, if we start our construction in the middle of lambing season, we need to be sure that we've got a plan in place for relocating those lambs that are birthing ewes. We have to decide, and like, is that going to be traumatic? And if there is loss of any crops or anything like that, how are we going to figure out the damages? And how do we have that conversation with the landowner? And I had a great one maybe 2 years ago where I called someone and I said, hey, Tom, we're probably going to start construction mid-September. And he's like, Laurie, you're going to have to pay all the crop damages. Could you wait 10 days? Like if it's September 15th versus September 31st, like or 30th, like that's a huge difference. And I was like, oh yes, let us start over here in this corner and then work our way towards the beans or whatever it was that needed to be harvested. So I think there's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot and it's supposed to be pretty effortless from the landowner perspective, but there should be a good amount of learning on the developer side of really understanding the person who's been there on the farm or on the property for so long, and incorporating that into the design and operation of the facility.
And what I'm taking from that and the overall theme is communication, and communicating what expectations are from the energy provider and the farmer. Let's talk more about how these projects can coexist with agriculture. You had mentioned livestock, and that was one of the questions that came in from one of the listeners, is how can we include livestock or even other crops growing within these projects that can really continue to build the environment as well as take the energy from it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of opportunity. I think we're at the beginning. So wind turbines are a little bit easier because the geographic space they take up is vertical, right? So it's like they're up in the air, and really you can run cattle, you can plant right up to the corner. I've worked with center pivot irrigation. You take out a section of pivot, but you're still able to irrigate your crop in the same way and just work around the wind turbine. I think solar panels are a more intensive use. And so I think what you're talking about with the coexistence is really important. And I think what has happened has been great is there's a ton of sheep grazing that's already happening. So much so that there are actually more solar projects wanting sheep grazing because it's such a win-win. It's a very low touch way to keep grass low enough so that it doesn't shadow the solar panels. So it's a really benefit. We'd have to be out there with mowing crews, but in fact, if we have sheep grazing, we can do that. And then there have been some great projects in Maine with low bush blueberries. And I know there are a couple of pilot projects in Colorado with where they're looking for farmers who are interested in growing beneath solar panels. So the idea that you would have these kind of slightly more elevated. So right now, solar panels probably at their tip height, when they're all the way like this, it's like 8 feet to the ground. So they're not particularly tall, but if you raised them up, you could start to really grow underneath them. You need shade tolerant crops and things like that. But the thing that I need someone to invent is goats and cows that don't mess with the wires. I mean, cows are out there scratching on their solar panels and just wreck them. And the goats, they just eat all the wires. So chickens are totally fine and sheep are totally fine, but we have yet to find, maybe we could raise the panels up high enough that the cows wouldn't bother them. But I think those are the two challenges, is some of the nature of the livestock out there and how curious they are and kind of strong. So that's been a challenge.
I can tell you for certain, as a woman who owns goats that are currently outside my office, they will do anything to ruin it. They will jump on it. They will eat it. Anything.
Exactly. No, and someone can tell you that who's an expert on goats. And then, of course, if you're a solar person, you're like, I'm going to see what happens. And I've seen the videos, and they're literally prancing on top of the solar panels, not a bother in the world, chewing on the wires. And it's dangerous and it's not good for anyone. So, yeah, we need to either find goats that aren't curious about anything, or we need to figure out a way to make the panels, withstand the force of a goat.
Absolutely. If anybody can figure that out, please let us know. Write us immediately.
Exactly. No, I think it's true. Well, I will say someone figured out just, 10 years into or 5 years ago, like that bifacial panels that you could put silicon on both sides of it, and there was enough bounce back light off of the ground, if the ground wasn't black, that it was worth it to do that. So I'm really here for technology. I'm sure one of your listeners has a great solution to my goat problem and to my cow problem, and I would love to hear it.
Absolutely. If anybody has a problem, ask a farmer or a rancher, because I'm sure they can figure it out. It's MacGyver.
That is very, very true. I definitely have experienced that.
Rural communities are the backbone of America, and renewable energy is helping them grow stronger than ever. Across the country, landowners are partnering with renewable energy developers to create long-term financial stability while keeping their land in production. CROP, the Center for Rural Opportunity and Power, provides farmers, landowners, and rural leaders with tools they need to explore these opportunities. From assessing land suitability to negotiating lease agreements, CROP offers clear, unbiased guidance to ensure landowners get the best deal possible. Whether someone is just starting out in their research or ready to take the next step, CROP is here to help. Visit cropamerica.com to learn more about how renewable energy is shaping the future of rural America. So, in your 20 plus years of experience, what have been, the biggest pros that you've seen with renewable energy versus what have been some of the cons has there been in that 20 years?
Yeah, exactly. And I always, folks can listen to this and they know that I work in this industry and I've worked in it a long time. And there are places to go. Like there's the Center for Rural Opportunity and Power that has a website that has a bunch of information kind of with these pros and cons that people can use as a resource. But additionally, yeah, some of the stuff I've experienced in my career is just some of the pros are in Pennsylvania, our dairy industry got really hit hard. And folks had a hard time keeping family farms or convincing second generation, third, fourth generation to stick around. So we were able to install solar panels on a portion of a dairy farm and to allow that landowner to have kind of a steady revenue stream that he could count on. So it's like a lease payment that's always going to come. So it gave some operational security to him and made it so he didn't have to sell or figure out another way to keep his land. So some of the economic benefits. Additionally, you work in a state like Ohio in the United States, we have a tax program where the solar projects and wind projects pay a different property tax, and that goes directly into the local school community. So there are ways in which these projects kind of benefit. Additionally, just the idea of providing learning to local kids and school communities and all that about what renewable energy is, that's kind of an incidental benefit. But a lot of the economic and benefit and the ability to keep farms. And as we've mentioned before, kind of wind turbines, their footprint is pretty small and they don't take up a lot of area. And so a farmer can kind of continue, a rancher can continue doing what they've always done. And then with a solar farm, like we've said, there can be some grazing opportunity, but additionally, the land isn't a solar farm after 35 years or 30 years or so. So there's a removal bond that's usually placed, that should be placed on any good project, that would remove the solar. And then you think about it that the soil's had a chance, it's had about 30 years to rest. And it just continues to be owned by the same people that whole time. So the next generation can make a decision about what they want to do. Which brings me to like some of the cons and the things I always ask people to really consider is it's a 30-year lease. It's a very long time. So to really think about what do you want, what view shed is important to you, is there a hickory tree or something that was like of significance to your family that you really don't want anyone to cut, or you don't want to have the view from a particular homestead location blocked, or you would really love to improve a farm road so that you can get access to a back corner that you've not had access to. So some of those things, when folks haven't felt empowered or haven't been asked to speak up by developers, then you can kind of see some of that relationship deteriorate, and it's not treated as like a partnership for 30 years. So I think that's a piece that I just always tell people to really consider, is that it's a big commitment and it's a long-term relationship you're entering into. So doing it for a quick monetary gain is one portion of it, but additionally as a long-term stewardship plan and part of estate planning or part of like planning with the next generation. Those are my favorite conversations when I'm sitting down with 2 or 3 generations, and it's kind of like I've been talking to dad and the son comes in, or I've been talking to mom and the daughter and son come in, and they're like, and then we all get, and then it becomes real brass tacks and they ask you a lot of questions, and that I feel like really gets down to what everybody wants to do and what's the priority. And sometimes having this additional revenue stream on a portion of, or the entire farm, can allow families to keep land that's been in their family for a long time around and in the family. So yeah, that's really important.
I think it's, the way that you described it, you're making this long-term commitment. And I'm thinking to myself, landowners might not be here in 30 years from today when they make this decision, right? So it is on the next generation, whether that's a child or a business partner or whatever it is. So really, it's a transition planning conversation more than it is a renewable energy conversation.
It is, yeah. And it's what we're going to be doing it's a plan about what's going to happen with the land and what's the ultimate goal with the land. And how does that align, and how does a renewable energy project align with the vision that the family has and that the community has? And so I think it's my job usually to facilitate and thread that needle, but I think it's always easier when people feel comfortable to speak up. So I think that part of doing this work and talking to you is so that people feel armed with a little bit more information so they can kind of ask those questions and feel a real sense of ownership and pride if they do decide to go forward with a renewable energy project on their.
Absolutely. The number one question that my listeners asked was the decommissioning process. What happens after that 20, 30-year contract is done, and or anything in between that happens? What is the responsibility of the farmer in that, and what can landowners expect?
I think it's critical. I mean, like we just said, you're thinking about this in the long term, and I don't think anyone is more cognizant of the rapid ways in which things can suddenly change than folks who are as connected to the land as farmers and ranchers are. So the idea that I always tell people is I really hope this doesn't happen, but let's plan for what if. So what if something happens, like a tornado comes through, or some part of the facility is. So the facilities are built in such a way that they can withstand kind of all the local weather systems that come through. But additionally, within your lease document, and then sometimes at the local county or township or state level, there's a requirement to post a security bond. So the idea is that decommissioning cost will exist and will live in a bond or an escrow account or a letter of credit, whether or not the developer is still there. I think I saw that maybe some of your listeners have talked about the fact that these projects get sold. And that is really true. They're assets. And making a deal with Laurie Mazer you're making a deal with a larger entity, and the lease is going to be the document that governs it. Not, I'll always pick up the phone, I guess, to my landowners and to anyone I've developed a relationship with, but I might not live forever. So I think folks need to make sure their lease provisions require a bond to be posted. We usually say in like year 5 or year 10 or so, when the facility's been up and running and made its money back, and there's maybe a little more risk that someone wouldn't do as good a job maintaining it because they've kind of made their initial investment back. And so we really encourage people to push for some sort of security and decommissioning bond that will allow anyone, not just the developer, to come in and remove the facility. And then, and then what is that? It's the foundations and some of the underground cabling or wires that are used to connect solar panels. Those are usually above ground, except where we're connecting big chunks of arrays, or the wind turbines connecting together. So you're removing, the solar panels are really just a stake that's driven into a steel pile that's driven into the ground, about 10 feet. And so that can get pulled out. And then the foundations of the wind turbines get either left and covered over with topsoil if that's what the landowner wants, or they can get demoed. And
see, there is an answer to all of these questions. You just have to find the right person to ask.
I know. I'm so glad to be that person, because these are things I wonder about too. Like, what happened? You look around and you're like, what is going to happen with that when no one wants to use it anymore? Like, what happens to shopping malls when no one goes there anymore? And I think we've all seen that. So
exactly. They have that big for lease sign sit on them for years and years to come. Mm-hmm. I want to talk about how renewable energy projects really benefit local communities. What are some of the benefits that you've seen over the last 20 years working on these projects?
Yeah. So some of the more like nerdy ones are the ideas that we actually upgrade the utility lines around us and can kind of build. Sometimes when you're in a rural community, you're kind of at the end of a transmission line, or you're midway. And if there's a cut or a break or a problem in the line, you can be blacked out for a pretty long time. So what we do is when we plug our projects in, they provide power closer to these local communities. And then additionally, we also pay for the upgrades to the utility system, some of which are related to our facility and some of which are just required for safe operations. So we kind of can build in some resiliency, maybe upgrade some power lines, put them on more stable poles and things like that. But probably the most impactful from a local community perspective is the tax base. There can be a real strong tax base that's provided, where it can either be taxed kind of in the millage rates that are already set. So a certain percentage goes to police, schools, fire, all that. Or projects can be used to kind of increase the overall general fund. And I've seen projects that have paid for teachers or school buses, fire departments, additional staff, things like that. So there's a lot of that. And then the other piece that we've already spent a lot of time on, which is just allowing local landowners to maintain and retain the ownership of property that's been in their family for a long time, with a diversified income stream when they've hit a bump or they anticipate there might be a bump. So yeah, I think there's a lot of ideas around stability and independence that really tie in with renewable energy projects.
We talk about there being that additional income for your farm. What does it do for property value for your farm?
So these are all the nitty-gritty details, Caitlin. It's like, what landowners ask ahead of time, because really, right, if I'm putting $100 million of equipment on your property, why should you pay the tax bill? So another key term in your lease is that any increase in your property taxes should be borne by the developer of the project and the owner of that equipment. And any good developer will work to really make sure that if it's not a subdivision, at least the local taxing authority knows how to tax their solar equipment and work in an agreement with them and get tax payments from them, and that the agricultural land will remain there. And then we always check to see if there's CRP or clean and green payments that are being made to a landowner where there's a rollback penalty. And that is also something that, if by installing a renewable energy project on your land, it causes a rollback tax event for the landowner, that should also be covered. So there really shouldn't be any tax difference, and that should all be borne by the developer who's choosing to put this on their project. The landowner should be receiving checks and they'll be dealing with a nuisance of construction, but then they should be just hopefully enjoying the revenue and kind of continued use of their property that either doesn't have solar panels or is leased to the wind farm.
So if you are a landowner or a farmer that is listening right now and wants to get started on this process or learn more, what are some good resources? Who can we turn to?
Yeah, I think some great places, at least in the U.S., the USDA and the U.S. Department of Energy have had a lot of resources in the past about renewable energy. And there's NREL, the National Renewable Energy Labs in Colorado, has a lot of just excellent studies where, like, the questions around property tax, the questions around screening, what are best practices, some of those questions, so that a landowner can come in kind of armed with their own. And then, as I mentioned before, there's the Center for Rural Opportunity and Power, CROP, which has its own website. And those guys do a good job of trying to present the pluses and the minuses. And I think once you know the pluses and the minuses, you can start to really form your questions and understand, someone mentioned that. Let me ask you a little bit more. So when are you planning to post that decommissioning bond? I didn't see it in this lease agreement. Or what do I have to do with regard to the permits? Like, do I have to, how is this going to impact me and my own taxes or things like that? So I think there are a lot of good resources that are out there. And I think any developer worth their salt should want to meet with you multiple times, should want to answer all your questions, and should want you to have legal representation to really help advocate for you, because these are really complicated, like 30 and 40 page lease documents that we said are going to be in effect for a really long time. So not feeling rushed or pressured would be really key components for me. If I was on the receiving end of my own phone call, I would want someone who was patient and took a lot of time to explain all the things.
Absolutely. One more plug for Crop America. The YouTube channel is great. There are so many farmer producer stories on there of people's experience with these projects that have come up. So definitely check that out. I will put all of those links in the show notes for people to find more information and get the resources and to get their questions answered. And honestly, find out more questions that they didn't know to ask.
Exactly. No, and you're so right about those farmer interviews. There's nothing better than seeing someone, and no one out there is sugarcoating it or saying things they don't believe, and they're talking about the real impacts to them and the pluses and the minuses. And I think that's a great idea. It's another great resource. It's just listening to some of those folks talk about their own experience.
Absolutely. Laurie, what are your hopes for the future when it comes to renewable energy?
I think it's been really fun to do things like Career Day and teach my kids about it. But additionally, I really love my job because I get to go out and talk to people about having a diverse energy mix, that there is this opportunity to have some homegrown solar and wind energy resources that power the country, power our communities, and all of the needs that we have, these growing electrical needs that we have, and the ability to serve those without putting any pollutants into the air and without kind of contaminating any streams or anything like that. And so I'm not one of those people who would say that we can power the entire world with just renewable resources. I think we need to have a pretty good mix of power out there. But I do think I've just seen in my own career, like kind of exponential growth and the number of these projects to really increase. And so I'm excited because, as everybody knows, the longer you do something, the better you get at it. So I really do think we're going to be hitting kind of a place where the technology is performing top notch. And additionally, we've been able to mitigate or incorporate things like agrivoltaics and figure out that goat problem you and I were talking about, and get some of these things that have been issues for renewable energy projects solved. I really have a lot of faith in the creativity and ingenuity of communities working on these projects. So yeah, I'm really excited for the future.
Very cool. Well, Laurie, we will put all of the links that we mentioned in the show notes about Crop America. For the listeners who would like to connect with you and for what you do, where can they find you online?
Yeah, so people always find me online, and it's fine to find just my profile on LinkedIn is a pretty easy place. I'm really responsive, and I'm always happy, and I've been able to just answer questions for folks and point them towards good resources and things, and have them ask me questions like, is this normal? Or is this a thing? And I'm like, yeah, that is a thing. People do ask for that. And like, yeah, some developers don't know if they're doing wind or solar, and they might want the rights to do both. And you're going to have to think about both at the same time. So yeah, I'm always more than happy to connect, but I will point people to kind of a more official site of the Center of Crop America and their ability to kind of answer questions and NREL and things like that. But yeah, always here for any questions that your community or listeners have. And I often think of my best questions 10 minutes after I've hung up the phone. So yeah, no,
me too.
I'm sure someone will listen. Yeah, exactly. Great.
Well, Laurie, thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us today. It has been knowledgeable. It has been helpful. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, well, I so appreciate it, Caitlin. And I really do feel like you and your community of listeners have, absolutely insightful questions, and ones that I'm really glad we were able to share some resources for, so folks can feel better and more empowered as they make decisions about what they're going to do with their land and how they want to use it going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Rural Woman Podcast. The Rural Woman Podcast is more than just a podcast. We are a community. A huge thank you to the Rural Woman Podcast team, audio editor Max Hofer. A special thanks to our Patreon executive producers, Sarah Riedner from Happiness by the Acre and Carrie Munven from Laystone Farms. To learn how you can become a Patreon executive producer or other ways to financially support the show, head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more. Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen to the podcast to get the latest episodes directly on your playlist. And if you are loving the show, please be sure to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform that accepts ratings and reviews. You can connect with us on social media at the Rural Woman Podcast and with me at Wild Rose Farmer. One of the best ways you can support the show is by sharing it. Send this episode to a friend or share on your social media. Let's strengthen and amplify the voices of women in agriculture together. Until next time, my friend, keep sharing your story. Did you know that you can get this same great episode of the Rural Woman Podcast ad-free? I get it. Listening to ads during a podcast isn't always my favorite either. But in order to keep the lights and coffee pot on here at the Rural Woman Podcast Studios, they are necessary. I am so grateful to each and every one of my sponsors, but if you yourself would like to skip the ads while supporting the show, consider joining me over on Patreon. Patrons of the Rural Woman Podcast get ad-free episodes starting at Tier 5 on their podcast player of choice each week, plus some other great benefits. Find out more by heading to the link in today's show notes to learn how you can become a patron through Patreon.